and I need this, thank you. So I was just talking about sartorial choices sitting in the seat. So that was all, I think, very interesting. What I'd like to do with this fireside chat is first just tell you who our panelists are, but I won't give you their long and distinguished biographies because you'll find those in the conference packs. I'll then ask each of them a kind of opening question and see what they come back with, and then we'll see where the conversation goes. So this is not heavily scripted, so wish us well. First of all, we have Agi Veres, who is director of the UNDP office in Geneva, but actually she has, wearing those responsibilities and others, worked, I think, on every continent around the world except the Antarctic, as far as I could tell. That includes, in particular, some very interesting times in China. And then Stephen Hibbert, who's the global lead on transition for ING Bank, and he's lived in more countries around the world than he can count and worked in many of them. And then we have Leon Kamhi, who is head of responsibility in EOS at Federated Hermes, whose products and advice, so much shaped by him, reach around the world. So if we're calling this session Geopolitical Risk and Ethical Finance, I think we've got the right people here on the stage. Agi, let me start with you. You spent part of your career in China taking, if we look at China, which has been taking more of a lead politically and economically through initiatives such as Belt and Road. We've been talking about that for a while. Can you tell us firsthand how is ESG viewed and considered in China?
Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to address this panel and focus on some of these questions. If you allow me, I'd like to put it into a little bit of a global context vis-à-vis China, rather than just jumping in what I can share with you on their approach on ESG. And I'd like to link it back a little bit to what we've heard in the keynote speeches and pick up two elements of it, which of course I fully agree with. One is the systemic nature of the response that we need. And we talk about systemic, it's not just systemic vis-à-vis the finance sector and all the elements of it, but it's systemic from a global collective perspective. So if we think about it, a collective response is what governments regulate, what the markets regulate, and what governments and markets can't regulate. There are international bodies like the UN that I work for that can step in and try to contribute with global public goods that fill in some of these gaps. So from our perspective, this systemic approach, of course, requires really global engagement. And the role of China cannot be ignored in that. The second element I'd like to pick up is scale. What we have been struggling with over the last decade is not just in making strides in meaningful impacts, and I think the speakers already referred to that, but making strides at scale with meaningful impact. And again, China's role is obvious in when we talk about scale. So if I look at back my experience, and just for those of you who have not read my bio, I left China in 2019. So at that time, when I was there were a couple of very interesting developments that describe a bit the dynamics that you're asking about in terms of the approach to ESG. In 2016, during China's G20 presidency, they have actually established the Sustainable Finance Group that brought together a lot of cooperation and efforts among various actors, not just the G20 countries, but also linking it to other mechanisms. And they have been playing a very lead and key role in other mechanisms as well. And I think, this moment was in a way quite significant, because not just the working group itself, but some of the other policy decisions and policy recommendations that have come through during that time period, and I will mention a couple of them. But if we fast forward a little bit to the recent announcement and pledges. In 2020, China announced that they will peak emissions by 2060, and they will phase out emissions by, or target market neutrality by 2060 and peak by 2030. And in 2020, they pledged to not build any more coal-powered plants. So all of these are policy decisions and policy announcements at the national and global arena. At the same time, I think we also have seen similar dynamism and positive change in the actual actions by Chinese enterprises and the institutions. That said, it doesn't go without the challenges that we are facing globally in this area. So the same issues prevail on ESG washing, the actual meaningful impact on the ground by investments, by Chinese investments, whether domestic or abroad. Now, going back to then what is some of the backbone behind these commitments. Again, just stemming from the 2016 engagements with the international and global commitments, China has put forward endorsed a project catalog, a sustainable project catalog in 2016 for green financing. And followed this, we have worked very closely with them and have published the first set of standards for sustainable financing with the China Development Bank, which included a lot of recommendations exactly along the lines of the need for standards that I think the cornerstone of any further action, and as we heard from the speakers, transparency is not enough. It has to come with standards and benchmarks and the instruments that are able to put that into perspective. It's also put in place some very significant comprehensive policy framework for green financing, which was quite novel at the time in 2016. Of course, it has been quite engaging globally beyond China as well. And we can also see some of the results coming out of it. China's total labeled green bonds, domestic and international, grew by 2.4-fold in 2020 on the year before, reaching about $110 billion. Then if you look at some of the recent actions, we also worked very closely with the new development bank, which was the first global development bank that has been issuing SDG bonds, and we worked on an issuance of $747 million bond in response to the COVID socioeconomic recovery. Now, the significance of this is, again, going back to what I started with, the systemic approach where we need to bring together public, private sector, and also international standards. And the contribution there was really about the international standards and trying to put incentives and put different approaches to the markets on this. Now, lastly, maybe just to mention a couple of points that I'm happy to pick up on later when we talk about China. It's not just the policy decisions, and it's not just kind of the announcement and pledges. There are some target domestic audiences, some target global audiences, and of course, there's a lot of balancing act there when it comes to the 3 Ps that we heard around including the political aspects of it. But I think at the same time, what we need to look at is what else is happening in China that may not be happening elsewhere in terms of innovation, in terms of technology, in terms of having the renewable energy solutions put in place and the scale and magnitude of that. And in addition to what I think many of you are familiar with the solar and wind energy progress, one of the most interesting things I visited back in, I guess, 2017 was the first hydrogen city that China attempted to transition into a hydrogen transportation and putting hydrogen-fueled buses on the streets of Rugao city. So when you're looking at actual advancements on the ground in China, I think there are a lot of examples that may be overlooked when it comes to actions. And I think there are a lot of opportunities, but together with challenges when we need to work with China. But one thing that I think we can't ignore is the role of China in this when it comes to scale and systemic approach. And from our perspective, it's the engagement we're looking for and a positive, collaborative, and collective efforts that hopefully will tilt the scale in the ESG approaches.
Agi, thank you very much. Very interesting first-hand observations. I've made some notes. I will come back to you. I've got some questions, but I'd like to bring in our other panelists. Stephen, I'll turn to you. things obviously have changed profoundly this year in light of the invasion in Ukraine. You're head of global energy transition. Has that changed in light of how things are situated just now? Has the conflict impacted either short-term or long-term that transition?
Yeah, that's been quite a challenge to think about over the past months. I think start off with maybe the good news first, and the scene having been set by Tarek. I'm pleased to say that for ING and I think for many in this space, the long-term goal, the long-term objective of global sustainability for the planet, a global economy which is sustainable, a net zero world by 2050, that remains in focus, and all the actions we take should be directed towards that. But there is no doubt that the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February certainly brought about a period of challenging thinking. And calls, if not by ourselves, on ourselves, but by others, to reassess priorities and think again about that long-term goal and the other more immediate short-term issues that needed to be addressed. And in the energy context, we're talking about what happened till the 24th of February for financial institutions that were if you like, actively and sincerely committed to energy transition, who are setting transition targets, developing metrics, gathering the data to guide themselves and provide evidence of successful transition on the road to the net zero world. A metric which was generally purely defined by achievement of, if you like, the SDG climate action goal, a reduction in emissions, and immediately there was a call that actually maybe the emissions reduction climate action side of things could be if not ignored, then perhaps temporarily postponed and put aside, and that the immediate concern should be one of energy security, and then related to that energy affordability, and so. For a bank like ING, which for several years had made commitments to reduce its oil and gas or to exit its coal market activities from 2017 to be fully exited by 2025, since 2019 to reduce the level of our upstream oil and gas financing activities in line with the global production curve set out by the IEA for net zero 2050. Whether that should be put aside in view of the fact that apparently we need more fuel now, there's not enough time to build the windmills, and let's start digging for oil and gas, and therefore ING, why don't you just set aside your restrictive fossil fuel policies and place your focus on other important social issues such as energy affordability and security of supply. For ING, it just to sort of just to give you the sort of context of decision making. Actually, in the middle part of last year, we had in our alignment commitment to achieve or to play our part in achieving net zero transition goals, we had committed to, as I said, to align the reduction of our oil and gas activities, the portfolio, in line with the reduction in global production levels of oil and gas set out in the IEA's net zero transition pathway. Now, those of you, you may remember that that pathway was set out in the special report prepared for the Glasgow COP. And there was one interesting statement in that report referring to the fact that if success in that pathway was achieved, it would be the case that no new oil and gas field development financing would need to have taken place for fields sanctioned after the 31st of December 2021. Now, that was interpreted by many as a requirement of fulfilling the pathway in the way that the scenario is constructed. It's not a requirement, it's a consequence. But we thought to ourselves, if we are sincerely committed to the fact that the goal is going to be achieved, then whether or not it's a consequence or a requirement, we should embrace the fact that no new oil and gas financing of new fields is required. And so we took a decision towards the end of 2021, early 2022, to put in place a more restrictive policy for our oil and gas finance activities in the energy sector, that we would be, and I think we calculated the first major global international bank to make that statement consistent with the NZE 2050 scenario. And then you get into the realms of communications and marketing and timing, and it turned out that there were a series of announcements and various events in early March of this year that would be the appropriate time to make this restrictive oil and gas announcement alongside another commitment that we made to significantly grow the level of our renewables financing activities by 50%, the portfolio to generation to increase by 50% by 2025. So all very exciting, all very good. And then the invasion of Ukraine came in, and suddenly lots of people within the bank who'd been very much supportive and indeed actively encouraging us to take this bold, supportive decision were suddenly saying, hang on a minute, how can it be that ING will be making an announcement about no longer financing oil and gas activities when now the focus of everyone is ensuring supply? And actually the answer to supply is to invest in more oil and gas production. Well, our answer to that was no, we don't agree. I mean, if we're talking short-term and long-term, it's going to take, on average, 5+, even up to 10 years to develop an oil and gas field. And if we haven't solved this problem by then, we're really in trouble. And so we stuck to our guns and said, no, we're going to keep our eye on the horizon. We're going to stay sincere to that global sustainability objective in 2050. But what we can do in the short term is not change the long-term goal, but certainly reassess how we address the world's short-term problems. And I suppose one of the lessons that we learnt in the energy sector from that was that up until then, I think we'd interpreted a commitment to sustainability, a commitment to energy transition, the sort of actions we should take, pretty much purely in terms of emissions reduction. And it was a salutary reminder that actually there are many other aspects related to energy which relate to other SDGs. And the fact is that energy affordability, security of supply, and the knock-on effects of maintaining those things, of access to clean and modern energy for all, you can't exclusively look at one and ignore the other. They have to be held in a balance. But at the end of the day, the climate issue is the largest problem, and so that is the one goal that we should not compromise. So I think with that, I'll stay.
Thank you very much. That was quite comprehensive and began to get at what one might call ethical decision-making within a financial organization. A quick response, yeah?
No, I won't.
No, okay.
Yep.
I'm just making a comment there. Leon, let me turn to you, and I want to stay a little bit with the idea of the transition and actually pick up on the Ukraine conflict, which has reverberated way beyond the borders of Ukraine and Russia, way beyond the borders of Europe. And I think, for instance, of potential food shortages, which will affect people in countries all around the world, and in particular, many countries in the South. We talk a lot at Jeffy about the North-South axis. We don't often think about the world that way, but it's important too. So you have food shortages, have cost of living increase, not just here, but many, many places. What responsibility do you think the finance sector has in these areas?
So, in many ways, I agree completely with what Stephen said. I see it as a three-legged stool. We need green green energy, we need energy affordability, and we need energy security. And each of the legs of those stools need to be, as you said, Stephen, in balance. So looking at it from a Federated Hermes point of view, so we're an investment manager, so we invest, typically in secondary markets. The second thing we do is engage or steward the issuers which we invest in to try and encourage them to work in line with the interests of the investors we serve. And thirdly, we advocate. So if I start with the green economy, the first thing we need to do is bring new money, new capital to green investments. And at the moment, that is not really happening. It kind of happens at the angel side, where there's a bunch of different ideas and some VCs will throw some money at it. And then it definitely happens, and there's probably too much competition for it when someone has got to the point where there is an investment idea which is there, and you can see the cash flows maybe just 2 or 3 years away. But where we really need significant investment, we need to take risks as an industry, is in that middle area, where there's ideas which need to be moved to production, to go all the way. And in areas which we've ignored, such as hydrogen, hydrogen has so much there's so many solutions coming from hydrogen, and yet we just don't see enough of it. And hydrogen is at the point where it's at the wrong point of the experience curve. It's still expensive per unit for a lot of its applications, and it needs to go down that cost curve. And the only way it will go down that is if we invest in it. The second way we can move to a green economy is through stewardship of the companies, typically companies which we invest in, which are in secondary markets. So divesting those doesn't do anyone any favors. It's at most indirect, because the board might see people divesting and say, well, what do we need to do to change? Engaging on capital allocation and what those companies do is an incredibly important obligation from the investment industry. Because those companies are going to have to take risks which their investment managers have been uncomfortable about before. No longer will it be quarter-on-quarter, consistent quarter-on-quarter returns. Investments need to be made and risks need to be taken. And as an investment industry, we need to be able to support the companies we invest in to make that. And we need to encourage companies to move out of just their activity and think about the activity as a whole, the supply chain. A builder has a certain level, a certain interest. The person who's going to actually be the tenant at the end of the day will want to pay less energy, and that requires the builder to put in the right sort of materials in not necessarily the cheapest materials, but the right sorts of materials in. So that's on the green economy. Now to the question which Dame Susan asked, what about energy affordability and what about the cost of living? So in many ways, I mean, for the avoidance of doubt, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is awful, absolutely awful, and the costs of it are huge. But it could be doing us a favor from a cost of living point of view. So in terms of energy affordability, if we are to move to a green economy, there are going to be increased costs, at least in the short and medium run. There's no doubt about it. Who suffers from that? The poorest suffer from it. Always will be the case. Now, what's happened now with the spike in energy, and let's face it, inflation might be 10% for the average person in the economy. Inflation is 15 to 20% for the poorest in society, because food and energy are a significant part of their basket. So we need to use this as an opportunity to think hard about how we're going to support the poorest, including the working poor. And there, as investors in companies, we can again engage with companies to be thinking laterally, thinking innovatively about how they can support the poorest employees in their companies. Could it be, for example, right now? Now, at the moment, if there's if real profits don't change and real wages don't change, we are going to have runaway inflation. So companies and unions need to come together and think about, well, what's the level of real profit cuts we need, and what's the level of real wage cuts we need? Now, if we do need real wage cuts as part of that, that has to be borne by the ones who are earning more. Because if that's not the case, it simply will be unsustainable in the literal meaning of the word for the working poor. And that will not be good for anyone. So right now, we need to see companies supporting the poorest workers, which they have, and also helping, could they buy energy in bulk? Could they buy food in bulk? And support their colleagues in that way. So let's see how the cost of living crisis, which we're going through at the moment, will then help us put in the right position to know how we might be able to help from an energy affordability point of view going forwards. I'm going to stop there and not go on to energy security because I think I've gone over my 5 minutes or so there.
Everyone's gone out of their 5 minutes, but you've all had such interesting things to say. I'd like to change tack slightly. I want to ask a question under the heading possibly of timeframes and pull on something that Tarek said in his video. He just mentioned in passing the increasingly short tenure for company CEOs. All of us probably, and even if you are a politician, will talk about the short timelines of politicians because of the election cycle. And then we fret because what we're talking about, particularly in environmental terms, but actually in social terms as well, we're talking about the long term, we're talking about the forever. And how do you square those issues, the short-term decision makers and regulators and policymakers, short-term thinkers, by the nature of what they do with the long-term outcomes that we're seeking. Would anybody like to jump in and address that? Stephen? No? Oh, you were leaning forward. No.
Okay, well then I'll jump in. I mean, I think certainly is, again, sort of looking at things from the standpoint that one best knows. I think sitting with ING, within ING, I think that one big change for us over the past few years has been the process of sustainability coming in reality rather than just in words, as it was 5 or 6 years ago, more and more close to the heart of what we do. And certainly, we had a major strategy update earlier on this year, and right at the top, under the headline, Making the Difference, there are 2 pillars that define the commercial strategy for all of the group's businesses, whether they're in wholesale and retail. And the first is, as you might expect from a bank, improving the customer experience. But the second, right up there now for the first time, is sustainability. And sustainability runs through every level of decision making, every level of strategic planning in the institution, in a structural way and in a way where KPIs are set and the board is answerable. And I think I can see it around me, and that is really driving change. And I think one of the other influencing factors there is that the mindset of senior leaders may still be connected to the past and related more to their pocketbook and short-term horizon, but they rely on the efforts of the younger workforce, and the younger workforce has an eye on the future, and protecting our future is something that really does define whether they turn up for work for institution X or Y. And I think senior leaders appreciate now that our whole mindset and approach has to change to accommodate the demands and wishes of the world and the younger generation as it is today. So with that, I'll...
No, thank you very much for that. Any other thoughts here? Agi?
Maybe just a short comment on the short-termism. I think from our perspective as a development organization, this is what we struggle with, because of course development impact happens on the long run, and that requires short-term policy decisions and implementations of that as well as long-term ones. So I think what we need to look at fundamentally and collectively is the right standards and benchmarks that are combining the short-term actions with long-term impacts, and that kind of linked to the whole transparency discussion that we had, so that the transparency is within this systemic approach that's combining the time frames. And the second quick point I'd like to make is, you alluded to that, is the role of youth. When we look around in the climate debate, it's not just Greta, but it's really the active participation of youth, because there is a broader recognition that it's about their future. And this is not just the climate agenda, but the socioeconomic impact of everything that's happening around the world. And looking at developing countries and now, the global south, we see a really good momentum on this. So if we can rely on that youth engagement, I think we can try to close the gap of governments that are, especially in some of the continents, largely run by an older generation with the public that's predominantly young.
And the only thing I would add, let's face it, all the incentives for government, in democratic countries and for corporations is short term. It's not going to change that quickly. What we need is leadership, very strong leadership.
Yep.
Thank you very much. And I think leadership will surface later on during this summit as well, so I'm glad that you mentioned that. Let me move to a slightly different topic, this one under the heading of what I would call dilemmas. I was saying it something yesterday. As a child, there was good and evil. You knew it was very clear what was right, what was wrong. But actually, as you grow up, it is less and less clear. And so we have lots of countries, as an example, which perhaps, and I think about China, but could think about lots of other countries, and often we should look in our own backyard, as it were, countries which don't have a very good record, or what some of us judge as being poor actions in relation to human rights, and yet they're making great progress and contributing in the area of environmental technology and change. We have companies that may be split in where they're better and where they're worse. What do we think as financiers about supporting, about being in the same room as these entities? Do you punish with finance, or do you support and help to change? Any thoughts there? Leon, let me start with you.
I know this conference has sometimes had an interfaith aspect to it, so I'll quote Ecclesiastes, which says that there is no person without sin. Everyone sins. Everyone doesn't do everything correctly. And in a similar way, that's true of countries, it's true of companies. And I think our focus needs to be on how we can improve ourselves, and then how we can improve others. It is very uncomfortable being invested in companies or countries which may not be doing the right thing. But being there gives us maybe a greater chance to improve things. And so that's, I think, the way we have to take the approach. There's a whole continuum of human rights abuses across countries. There is that. How do we address it? I think engagement is the right approach, uncomfortable as it is.
Any other? Agi, let me just ask you, not to make a political comment, but China would be a country looking at this distance and through this lens that might have that split between human rights and yet tremendous contribution to technologies that are helping with the transition. What's your view? Better to be working with and possibly influencing more widely?
I think it's always better to try to influence the trends. So even if it's a drop in the ocean, it is a drop in the ocean rather than non-engaging. So from our perspective, we have initiatives, for example, on business and human rights. So looking at how enterprises, how companies and the private sector can include sustainability, human rights in their own operating practices, as well as the outputs that they generate. So if we have a better understanding of what difference this can make and how companies can embrace some of those recommendations and guidelines, I think the impact will be also very different.
Good. Thank you very much. Anything to add, Stephen?
No, other than agreement and just again sort of setting the context in my world, say, of dealing with oil and gas companies as our clients. And the approach we take there is one of engagement. And I think there we see the opportunity of continuing engagement gives one the opportunity of influence. And divestment means that you're separating yourself from the problem. You no longer have an influence on it, and the chances are you're encouraging the activity to just continue to one side. So I think engagement is the key to this.
Thank you very much. I think we have unanimity from different perspectives around the table here, and that is sort of jump in and get your feet muddy, basically, and wade through it and try to make some kind of difference. I'm going to pull this session to a close now and maybe make two comments. One, again, going back to Tarek's video, what he was talking about, at least to my ears, was how financiers operate, how all of us operate, even as we think we're addressing issues of sustainability and the challenges that are on the table. It's the decisions and the approaches we take that are born in what it is to be operating in finance and operating with numbers and coming out with numbers that are different. And so I would just leave you with a thought that maybe what we have to do, and I think it was implicit in his comments, is to think about how we actually act as financiers. It isn't just about sustainable funds and playing games, or even if we know we're doing that or not. It's how do we start with the impact, with the result on the ground, and draw that back into finance. So as a banker myself, I leave that challenge on the table with all of you, and I would just close by saying that we care about the planet because we care about ourselves, because we exist in the planet. You can't take the people, the S, out of the E, the environment. And I think we need to keep that in mind as the day goes on. Thank you all very much for your attention, and in particular, thank you to my wonderful colleagues.